Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Crown Commercial Service, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on tackling modern slavery in our supply chains. My name is Charlene McGuinness, and I recently took up the position of Head of Policy Delivery at Crown Commercial Service after spending over 12 years in category and commercial roles in the organisation and its predecessors. It's a privilege to be able to speak to you today about some of the exciting things CCS is doing to detect and address modern slavery in public sector supply chains, and what we can do to help you, our customers. So today, firstly, to set the context, we'll talk about what modern slavery means and the laws around modern slavery. Next, I'll talk through what CCS is doing to help you, our customers, tackle modern slavery in our supply chains, how we're working together across the public sector to address it, Crown Commercial Service's actions on modern slavery so far, and I'll be sharing some of our main observations and learning to date. Lastly, I'll be talking about what the future holds for CCS in this area and what you as public sector procurement professionals can do to help. And finally, in terms of questions, we won't be able to answer those on the spot today. However, we are happy to take any questions that you do have. If you've got a question, please send it in to us using the WebEx chat function. We'll gather these together and respond to them in a follow-up email to all attendees. So, what is modern slavery? In short, it's a severe exploitation of people for personal or commercial gain. It's often hidden out of sight and can take many forms, such as abusive working and living conditions, abusive vulnerability, isolation and restriction of movement, including the retention of identity documents such as passports, intimidation, threats, physical and sexual violence. So what should we be looking out for? There are a number of risk factors in supply chains that we as procurement professionals should be looking out for as they present a higher risk of labour abuse and slavery in the supply chain. A key source of information that I'd recommend to you is the Global Slavery Index. This provides a country-by-country ranking of the number of people in modern slavery, as well as an analysis of the actions governments are taking to respond and the factors that make people vulnerable. The first risk factor that we'll look at is commodity type. The Global Slavery Index highlights that for the UK, the top 5 imported products at risk of forced or compulsory labour are garments, electronics, fish, cocoa and rice. Next, we should consider the location of suppliers. No country is free of slaves, but slavery is more common in some countries than in others. The Global Slavery Index has a really insightful map tool which shows the prevalence of slavery, including forced compulsory labour, but sexual exploitation and trafficking as well in each country. Some of the countries where slavery is most prevalent include Bangladesh, China, Colombia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt and Myanmar, which is where the picture on the opening slide was taken in a garment factory. Next, think about the nature of the workforce involved. Where there's a low-skilled or low-paid work, this is open to exploitation. If there's common temporary agency or seasonal work, or dangerous or physically demanding work, there's a higher risk of abuse. Where workers are in isolation, either working in rural locations, home-based or in unmonitored and unregulated environments, this increases the risk to employees. Also, where there's reliance on migrant workers, we have seen examples of passports being withheld. Next, look at whether the goods or services are in an at-risk sector. There is evidence of forced labour in the industries covered by the Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority within the UK. However, forced labour is occurring in other sectors as well, including significant ones such as care, construction and hospitality. Think about the supply chain model that's in place. The larger and more complex the supply chain, generally speaking, the harder it is for an organisation to know about conditions for workers in that supply chain. Things to look out for are purchasing that is predicated only on a profit margin matrix, i.e. with rapid turnaround times, high production flexibility, low profit margins for large quantities of goods, or a dependence on unreliable trends. This can leave workers vulnerable to exploitative practices. The use of labour recruiters in supply chains. Recruitment through labour brokers can increase the risk of trafficking and forced labour due to the prevalence of corrupt practices and recruitment fees. Complex employment relationships with a reliance on agency, outsourced or subcontracted workers adds another layer of separation between employers and workers, leaving workers exposed to unethical practices. The ILO Forced Labour Indicators sets out key principles to help identify workers who may be in a forced labour situation. And finally, the context in which suppliers are operating. Inadequate labour laws and regulations in the country of origin with little or no enforcement. presence of cheap labour and high numbers of vulnerable workers. This might include women, children, young workers, migrants, minorities, groups with a history of discrimination or exclusion of workers with disabilities. The absence of effective grievance mechanisms and representative worker organisations or collective agreements. Some situations, workers are discouraged or prevented from joining an independent trade union. In others, collective agreements are reached between a ghost union and an employer with no consultation with the workers. These are known as protection contracts. A lack of business and/or government accountability. Widespread discrimination against particular groups, for example women or certain ethnic groups, much like what we've seen with the Uyghur population in China. Wars and conflicts also create high levels of poverty and unemployment which are ripe for exploitation. All of these can create the conditions in which workers can be exploited and abused. Where your suppliers have produced modern slavery statements, these should set out where their supply chains are located, the nature of the risks in relation to those locations. Industry bodies and trade groups may also have specific reports on modern slavery in their sector, which you could find very useful. Why are there so many slaves today? Slavery is big business. Globally, slavery generates as much as $150 billion in profits every year. More than a third of this is generated in developing countries, including the EU. Whereas slave traders 2 centuries ago were forced to contend with costly journeys and high mortality rates, modern exploiters have lower overheads thanks to huge advances in technology and transportation. Modern migration flows also mean that a large supply of vulnerable, exploitable people can be tapped into for global supply chains in the agriculture, beauty, fashion and sex industries. What about in the UK? It's easy to view slavery as an abstract concept that only affects people in faraway countries, but it's surprisingly prevalent here in the UK. Between 10 and 13,000 people in the UK are victims of modern slavery. That's roughly the population of Knutsford. Most of them are entitled to be here. They're EU migrants and UK citizens. Even though there were victims rescued from 116 nationalities last year, most of the victims were British, then Vietnamese and Albanian. Forced labour is about 46% of all exploitation in the UK, and the victims are mainly male EU nationals trapped by debt bondage, forced to work off debts they have no control over. You may have seen them washing your cars or tarmacking your drive. The UK construction sector employs approximately 3 million people and is one the GLAA consider to be a high-risk industry for labour exploitation. Pay is a major issue. Some workers receive only £5 a day, while others aren't paid at all. Most of their wages end up being spent on rent for accommodation, often caravans on their, for want of a better word, owner's land, with the conditions described as inhumane, unsafe and overcrowded. Deception and abuse of workers' self-employed status is common. Migrant workers who may not necessarily understand their employment rights are frequently exploited in this way. Safety is something which is rarely given a second thought. Serious accidents have occurred where workers have not been given appropriate training to operate machinery. In some cases, compensation has been offered to stop victims talking to the authorities, but unsurprisingly, this isn't always paid. According to research by the Health and Safety Executive, the construction industry accounts for 22% of fatal injuries, even though it only accounts for 5% of the UK workforce. In short, it's happening a lot closer to home than many of us would be comfortable admitting. So now we have 2 very good examples of real life stories where slavery has been happening in the UK. The BBC News article on the left-hand side talks about the Rooney family, who enslaved 11 people, including one for 25 years. They made that man dig his own grave and told him that that's where he'd go if he didn't sign his contract. Their victims were aged between 18 and 63, held in squalor and forced to work up to 12-hour days, 7 days a week for the family's tarmacking company. Many were alcoholics and estranged from their relatives, while several had learning disabilities and mental health issues. Half were British nationals, targeted from all over the country because they were homeless. Often their only payment was a packet of tobacco and a limited amount of alcohol, which didn't help their addictions and was another way in which the defendants exerted control over them. Their victims weren't physically trapped. They were financially, emotionally and physically abused, making any escape seem impossible. On the right-hand side, we have the headlines that hit us in the early summer this year. Garment factory workers in Leicester being the victims of exploitative labour practices in the supply chain of Boohoo.com, paid as little as £3.50 an hour. So it's very real and it affects lives of people a lot closer to home than a lot of us might have realised. Now let's look at what the law says about modern slavery and what we should be doing about it. The main legislation around modern slavery is the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. Section 1 of the Act makes it an offence to hold another person in slavery or servitude, or to require another person to perform forced labour or compulsory labour, in circumstances where they know or ought to know that this is the case. Section 2 of the Act makes it an offence to arrange or facilitate the travel of another person, known here as V, with a view to their exploitation. Section 4 makes it an offence to aid, abet, counsel or procure a person to traffic another person. For slavery or trafficking, the sentences are set out above. You could be subject to a fine or up to a year in prison for a summary conviction, or both. Or you could go to prison for life if convicted on indictment. But what does the Act mean for businesses? Section 54 of the Act requires commercial organisations which meet the below criteria to prepare a slavery and human trafficking statement for each financial year of that organisation. They must supply goods or services and have a total turnover of over an amount set out by the Secretary of State, which is currently set at 36 million. The Home Office recently announced plans to extend this requirement to public bodies with a budget of 36 million or more in England, Scotland and Wales. If the organisation has a website, it must publish their slavery and human trafficking statement on their website and include a link to that statement in a prominent place on their website homepage. If the organisation doesn't have a website, it must provide a copy of the slavery statement to anyone who makes a written request for one within 30 days. Next, let's talk about how CCS can help you, our customers, in tackling modern slavery in our supply chains. So in terms of what CCS is doing to tackle modern slavery, firstly, we're on your side in this. CCS has zero tolerance of modern slavery infiltration in our supply chains. We are determined to ensure that you can have confidence in our supply chains by applying strong diligence. We work closely with the Home Office and Cabinet Office to develop our approach to tackling modern slavery. In 2016 to 2018, CCS were strongly involved in the development of the Modern Slavery Assessment Tool known as MSAT with the Home Office, Cabinet Office and civil society. In 2018 and 19, CCS ran a successful small-scale pilot with 96 ICT suppliers. We also supported a Cabinet Office-led MSAT exercise with all strategic suppliers to government. The outcome of that pilot helped inform the development of the MSAT tool further, and the MSAT was updated with simplified assessment questions added. In 2019, we ran the first large-scale national exercise using MSAT. We identified 26 commercial agreements in sectors classed as high risk by the Home Office, and from those 26 commercial agreements we invited 285 suppliers to complete the assessment. 210 suppliers have completed it to date, that's 74% of the suppliers. This year, the outcome of the MSAT exercise in 2019 helped inform the UK Government Modern Slavery Statement, which was published in March. We ran a full MSAT campaign for over about 300 suppliers across a number of agreements. We've combined this with a strong communications approach designed to generate buy-in from our suppliers, bearing in mind that the MSAT is not mandated by law. We've also been carrying out internal training of category colleagues to help them analyse the results and the recommendations of the MSAT tool and to hold review conversations with suppliers. We're also carrying out internal training to upskill CCS category teams and agreement managers to help them set up and run their own campaigns on the MSAT tool. Modern slavery risk management is becoming embedded as a regular feature of category level supplier relationship management within CCS, and this is a powerful tool in helping us do that. Also, this year, work is beginning on compiling the first Crown Commercial Service Modern Slavery Statement. So in terms of what CCS is doing to practically implement measures to tackle slavery in our supply chains, we've taken a three-strand approach with actions at the pre-procurement, procurement and post-procurement or contract management stages of the contract lifecycle. For the pre-procurement stage, every business case for a new procurement must state whether the market risk for modern slavery is considered high, medium or low. We're using the GCF Tackling Modern Slavery Guide to determine the level of risk in each upcoming framework or contract. We build this into the supplier engagement stage, advising potential bidders at industry days that for contracts identified as being at high or medium risk of slavery, successful bidders will be required to complete a modern slavery assessment via the MSAT tool once awarded. During the procurement stage, we have a few standard requirements built in now. As part of the selection questionnaire, there are mandatory exclusion questions about suppliers' history of child labour abuses and human trafficking. We have had instances where suppliers have been excluded for these reasons. Where suppliers fall above the turnover threshold of 36 million, they must provide their TISC statement to CCS. They must update this annually and publish it on their website. The Public Sector Contracts Corporate Responsibility Schedule, Joint Schedule 5, includes clauses which require suppliers to report on modern slavery prevention action. Again, for contracts identified as being at high or medium risk of slavery, successful bidders are asked to complete a modern slavery statement as part of the terms of the agreement. During the tender process, suppliers commit to these T's and C's should they be awarded a place in that agreement. This all means that for any of our new agreements in those medium to high risk categories, you can rest assured that we are working with the suppliers to understand their supply chains as standard practice. Post-procurement, in contract management stage, I talked earlier about how we initially identified 26 agreements as being at a high or medium risk of modern slavery, and as part of our first campaign, 285 suppliers have so far been invited to complete the modern slavery assessment. The MSAT's become a standard practice for new agreements as they come online in those medium or high risk categories as we are building it into our terms and conditions. As we've been upskilling our category and contract managers on modern slavery in the MSAT too, they are able to have positive and constructive conversations with suppliers, empowered by the information and the recommendations that the MSAT has provided. This is becoming a regular part of our supplier relationship management process within CCS. To be clear, this isn't about punishing suppliers or catching them out. It's about working together to continually improve and solve problems collaboratively. So that's been the journey so far for Crown Commercial Service, but we have a few key learnings that we can share with you. Firstly, modern slavery activity isn't always easy to find, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. It can be buried deeply and remotely in supply chains and can be invisible and unknown even to Tier 1 suppliers. The Modern Slavery Assessment Tool is therefore a really powerful one, which has allowed CCS to identify its highest risk supply chains and begin constructive conversations with our suppliers. Preventing modern slavery in public sector supply chains is likely to be most effective if it's done in cooperation with industry. CCS considers that most of its suppliers are committed to preventing modern slavery, are equally horrified by it, and would wish to avoid the taint of being associated with it. I think the high response rate of 74% on the MSAT demonstrates that our suppliers don't want to stick their heads in the sand about this. And it's in that spirit that we are having the conversations with our suppliers going forwards. So with everything I've discussed in mind, let's look ahead to the next steps that we can take to address the issue of slavery in our supply chain. Within CCS, we have a few activities in the pipeline for the short to medium term. The initial campaign work in CCS was done by a central team because the tool was untried and high levels of coordination were needed. This prevention work is now being devolved to category teams where the activity will become part of the routine supplier engagement and performance review process. Modern slavery risk protection is a long-term requirement and we will work with our teams to integrate into the business as usual. This will require considerable upskilling across CCS, which I've mentioned is ongoing. Some category teams, for example construction, have significant procurements under development in high-risk supply chains and we are working to support them in this. The MSAT tool is currently in the same format for a multinational as it is for a small SME. We'll therefore look at different options to ensure the balance of requirements we make is in proportion to the size of a company and the likely risk it presents. And finally, as I've mentioned before, CCS will be working on its own modern slavery statement. So I've talked you through the steps that CCS has taken to date in addressing modern slavery, and I hope this has given you some confidence and assurance that we are committed to eradicating slavery in our supply chains, and that we've undertaken the necessary due diligence in procuring and managing our agreements to create a strong foundation to build upon. But this is not something we can do in isolation. We need all organisations across the public sector to work together with us, with our supply chains, and with civic society to be effective. So let's discuss the role that you can play in addressing this significant and global issue. Firstly, you should continue building and developing your own longer-term capabilities. Some of the tools we have available are the MSAT, the Modern Slavery Assessment Tool. It's open to all organisations to use, and suppliers can share their reports and recommendations with you via the tool. Supplier relationship management skills. It's critical that we follow up the MSAT with SRM. Your supply base has capabilities that we don't necessarily have as public sector buyers. Let's use that, let's leverage that, and let's work with the suppliers to make positive improvements. Where suppliers have completed modern slavery statements, check them, scrutinise them, ask questions. Are they updating them? Don't be afraid to challenge them to provide more clarity, but in an encouraging way. Networks are an important mechanism to share and exchange important information. Network wherever you can, whether it's on LinkedIn, with others in your sector, with suppliers, industry bodies, or with civil society. Let's use these networks to share knowledge of known issues and share best practice. Work in partnership with your suppliers and build a shared problem-solving approach with them. In every discussion you have regarding modern slavery, try to make it real to people. Use lively training material, show how it manifests locally, for example in Leicester with Boohoo, or using the example I did earlier with the Rooney family. It's not just a problem in a faraway place, put it into context. Be clear that we are collectively addressing and preventing a serious crime and commit a proportionate amount of resource to achieving this outcome. With that in mind, inform the Home Office Modern Slavery Unit of any significant, serious and urgent concerns you have about your supply chain, and share important alerts from the Home Office with your commercial teams as they come through. In summary, let's continue to work together to make a positive improvement for many people around the world. And that concludes my webinar for today. I hope you found it informative and that I've inspired you to go back to your day-to-day work with a fresh lens and a determination to work together to address the issue of modern slavery. Don't forget, we are here for you. You can get in touch with us by email or by phone if you need further information or support. We will of course send a copy of slides to all attendees for your reference. Thank you very much for your time today. I hope you can join us for some of our other upcoming webinars. The details are on the website on our events section. If you do have any questions that you'd like us to answer, please pop them into the chat box now. We will leave the session open for another few minutes to allow you to ask any questions that you might have. We will come back to you in a separate email to follow up on those. But thank you very much once again for your time, and I'll speak to you soon. Okay, I'm going to close down the slideshow now. If you do have any further questions, make a note of the email address on the screen right now. You can drop us a line at info@crowncommercial.gov.uk if you've got any further questions once the webinar closes. Thank you very much for your time today.